This episode is sponsored by PAX, the gold standard in emergency response bags. So when you're working under pressure, you need kit to be both dependable, tough and intuitive, and that's exactly what you get with PAX. Every bag is handcrafted by expert tailors who understand the demands of personal care, from the high-tech, skin-friendly and environmentally responsible materials to the cutting-edge welding process that reduces seams and makes cleaning easier. PAX absolutely puts performance first. They've partnered with 3M to make perfect reflective surfaces for better visibility, and bright grey interior makes finding kit effortless and fast even in low light. With over 200 designs, PAX bags are made to suit your role, your needs and your environment. And thanks to their modular system, many bags work seamlessly together no matter the setup. PAX doesn't chase trends, their designs stay consistent, so once you know one, you know them all. And if your bag ever takes a beating, their in-house repair team will bring it back to life. PAX are built to perform, made to last. Learn more at pax.bags.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
In today's episode, I'm speaking with former EMT Bruce Goldfarb. So on the 13th of January 1982, Washington, D.C. was paralyzed by a historic snowstorm, which really brought about a unique set of circumstances. So not only one catastrophe, but two in the same day. So Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into the 14th Street Bridge, sending wreckage and passengers plunging into the frozen Potomac River. Whilst across the city, on the same day, the metro system suffered its first deadly derailment. Really amidst the chaos and freezing temperatures, first responders, bystanders and civilians came together that day in acts of extraordinary courage that defined one of the most harrowing days in the capital's history. So in this episode, we're going to speak with journalist, author and former EMT Bruce Goldfarb, really around his new book, which is titled The Worst Day, A Plane Crash, a Train Wreck and the Remarkable Heroism in Washington, D.C. The book really deconstructs that day minute by minute and goes through really the eyes of survivors, rescuers and witnesses, drawing from years of interviews and Bruce's own frontline experience. We're going to really explore the operational challenges of that day, but also the humanity, the improvisation, the compassion and resilience. Bruce, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
I wondered, as a framer, Bruce, just to really set the scene for listeners, could you maybe just take us back to that day on January 13th, 1982, and maybe really just unpack what made that day so extraordinary in the history of Washington, D.C.'s emergency services?
Well, it was a unique set of circumstances in a unique place, and I think that the setting of Washington is a large part of the story because it's really um, it's almost like a colony. It has its own little government, and it's very territorial, and there's all these different jurisdictions. A lot of it is federal property, so you have federal agencies, local government, local law enforcement, fire departments, and it's surrounded by Maryland and Virginia, and that's two counties in Maryland, two counties of Virginia. So there's a whole cluster of different things that occur in the region. And on January 13th, as you mentioned, there was this really truly historic snowstorm that had paralyzed much of the country and blanketed the eastern U.S. with snow, record low temperatures. And so that was the day when these things occurred. And there had not been a commercial aviation crash in Washington in 33 years, not since shortly after World War II. So it was really, for all practical purposes, an unprecedented set of circumstances. Nobody who was working in emergency services at the time had ever dealt with an airplane crash in the Washington area. It just had never happened in anybody's experience. And not only did these two mass fatality incidents happen on the same day, but they were literally minutes apart. They were nearly simultaneously. And the airplane crash occurred on the very edge of the city's jurisdiction. So they had to go to the furthest point in Washington, D.C., where all of these different jurisdictions, um, uh, uh, governments all come together. And it became a cluster. It was really an unimagined, unprecedented set of circumstances that nobody had ever dealt with before.
Yeah, indeed. And I think, having been involved in a few major incidents myself, just one can overwhelm the system. But like you said, having sequentially two in short time frames in different areas of the city, both complex, both mandating a multi-agency response, but also both involving, multiple casualties with quite varied injuries and pathologies, super complex. And I think something you speak to, which adds a layer of complexity to the situation, was the freezing temperatures. So it's absolutely freezing. It's the depths of winter, and that not only adds a layer of complexity, but adds to the injury load because that profound hypothermia. But could I get you to speak to really, how the simultaneous events, the Air Florida Flight 90, and indeed the metro derailment, fundamentally challenged the coordination of the system?
It challenged it in many ways. The biggest problem was a lack of communication and not really having a clear sense. And I make it very clear. And these things happen in real life. You get bits and pieces of information coming to you, and so it was unclear early on exactly the nature of the incident, where it occurred, um, and you mentioned earlier that you yourself have been through some major incidents, but I mean that's what the benefit of. I assume that you have been trained more recently since than the 1980s, so you're benefiting from the experiences and the lessons learned that have come from incidents such as this. But it was, it's having one having an airplane go down in urban area is itself a hugely major incident that requires all sorts of specialized resources. You need water response. You need machinery, cutting tools to rescue people and extricate them from vehicles. You need scuba people. You need all the specialized stuff. And then you have a second one that again requires specialized equipment. This one's underground. You need heavy cutting equipment, most of which is already on the 14th Street Bridge being used. And so having these things, one would be enough, but having two occur at the same time under these circumstances, and of course they had no control over the weather, which itself had literally shut down Washington. The streets were absolutely gridlocked, and there was nowhere for the traffic to go. So it was very, very difficult in every way imaginable to assess the nature of the incident, to respond to it, to get the equipment where it was needed, coordination of all these things all came into play on that day.
And so we're gonna put the link to the book in the show notes. It's a fantastic read, and it really does denote in detail like you said, the multifactorial stressors on the system that day. But could I get you to speak to really, in your mind, Bruce, what stood out to you about the operational response and decision making under pressure from that day?
Yeah, I was really, considering that these were literally, unimaginable. It had never been considered before. They had never been a a rescue training disaster drill in cold weather. So, finding yourself with a really daunting set of circumstances, how quickly people were able to respond. The system itself was resilient, and that they were able to accommodate and adapt. Um, they unfortunately did not have anything on hand that would help rescue somebody from being stranded in the middle of an iced over river. That got resolved in its own way, and they actually did fix things and correct things afterwards. But people that day, they did their job ably. They did what they're supposed to do. They adapted, they improvised, and I think that because they had that, they saved lives were saved. I think it could have been much as bad as it was. It could have been worse.
Yeah, indeed. No, indeed, Bruce. And a fantastic component that we'll just broach right now, which often is an unsung component. You know, you did a lot of interviews with bystanders and indeed rescuers that just came to help that day. And so really, Bruce, from your interviews, what did you get from and indeed learn about the sort of psychology of, I guess in a way, fundamentally ordinary people that stepping into this ordinary, extraordinary circumstance?
That's really what drew me to the that whole day to begin with. When I saw this video, and it's bitter, bitter, bitter cold, and the snow is blowing, and here are these people. There are some you can clearly tell they're in military uniforms, but there are many people who are wearing street clothes, short sleeve shirts, just regular people who stepped out of literally their comfort zone to go and stand in a snowdrift and step into freezing water to help somebody that they don't know. And it really, in working on this, it really, it was such I just, it reinforced my faith in humanity. It was just that in talking with these people, and to a person, I tracked down and I spoke with the helicopter pilot, people who were at the riverside, and none of them, they're to a person, they just said, you know, I did what had to be done. And in that moment, I was just doing what any person would do to help another person. But it really, I found it inspiring. It really, you know, these values of the sense of community, that we're in this together, that you know, we help one another. And it really took me back to a different time. I hope that we still have these. And I wonder, in the course of doing this, and you read what people like Roger Olean and some of these folks did on that day, whether I could do, I like to think that I could, that I would step up, and at my own peril, literally at my, you know, would I risk myself? I hope that, I think that I would risk myself to save somebody else. I've never been in quite in that situation, but it just really made me feel good to know that people like that exist, and that people will.
So you made a great point, Bruce. You know, you talk about the systems and processes now, or indeed 5, 10 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago. But in 1982, you know, things were very, very different. Like you say, modalities of communication were different, technology was different. You're talking, this is a pre-mobile phone era. And I think it's really
Exactly.
important to recognize that, you know, mobile phones were non-existent. And so, you know, it's absolutely a different time. So could I get you to really speak to what you found from, because you spoke about, you know, the challenges of communication, Bruce.
Yeah.
How, just could you speak to really that what you found from that common shared narrative around how communication occurred, and indeed how coordination occurred from that multi-agency response before modern technology existed?
Yeah, there were I forget, I think there were like 19 different agencies that were fire departments, police departments that ultimately were on the scene from different jurisdictions. They were using, I believe, 9 different radio frequencies. And this was the day of the Motorola's, where, you know, you we had a channel, and that's what we were assigned. And so we could speak with our people, but you couldn't speak across jurisdictions. So people from Virginia firefighters couldn't speak with their counterparts in Washington, D.C. They couldn't speak with, they needed an ambulance there at the riverside. They couldn't, there were ambulances on the bridge. They had no way of communicating with them directly. And a lot of this interoperability, it's a buzzword. It's, I mean, it's standard today that where we do share these frequencies, and we can communicate across jurisdictions. But that was not so in the day. And that was one part of it. And the other part was, um, and it came up on 9/11 as well. The absence of repeaters in the subway system, so that the fire department, once they went underground, their radios could no longer communicate with the above ground, and so they did not have these radio repeaters. And that was the same problem in the Twin Towers, where they had firefighters going up the stairs, and they're unable to communicate with them and let them know that the building was unstable and to evacuate. And I know that that has, you know, they corrected it in Washington. You know, in many more places, they're aware of the need for this sort of thing. But it was a serious problem. And again, what they did was they improvised. They would, in the tunnel, they created a daisy chain of radios. They had people positioned at different points. They would send couriers on foot to run and deliver messages. We need the Hearst tools down here. And so they did whatever they overcame, and they dealt with it in the moment, and they made it work. It didn't always work well, but they did make it work.
So let's talk about the role of the Park Police helicopter. So the Park Police helicopter's rescue crew was really hovering over the icy Potomac River, and became an iconic moment in media, but also in the rescue. Can you really just tell us more, if possible, Bruce, around their actions and indeed what they represented for aviation-based rescue operations at the time?
Yeah, the Park Police, the U.S. Park Police has an aviation unit in Washington, and their job is the typical law enforcement support role. They do overhead surveillance. They are involved in presidential motorcades and these sorts of things. Occasionally, because the Park Service includes things, some wilderness areas like Rock Creek Park, they will occasionally do medevac um, uh, 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 transports, but that's they can fit a stretcher on these. It's a Bell Jet Ranger. I mean, it can hold a stretcher, but it was not equipped for rescue. It had skids. And it didn't have a hoist, so they would land if they had to do a medevac. They would land, put a patient on it, and then take off and go to the trauma center. And so it was that day it was practically a blizzard. There was a ceiling of 200 feet, which is about as tall as the buildings in Washington, not much taller, and visibility of a quarter mile. And it was absolutely beyond the conditions that were acceptable for safe helicopter flying. They don't have the instruments that a plane does to ground sensing and altitude and these sorts of things. So it's very, very dangerous. And these helicopters all fly under the visual flight rules. So it was far beyond the parameters for safe flight. Everybody was grounded that day, everybody from Marine One to the state police, everybody. But when the call came in, they didn't hesitate. There was somebody in need. It may have been on Park Police property, and so they went up. They went up in the air, and he made it to the scene by following bumper to bumper traffic. He knew the street route, and he just flew very, very low over the street through the city, found the crash site, and they were really the only people who were able to reach the scene, and they were not equipped. They had nothing. They had no hoist. They didn't have a stretcher to drop down. They had no rescue equipment, and fortunately, the pilot, Don Usher, was a Vietnam had been trained to fly in Vietnam and had flown in combat under all sorts of really crazy conditions. And he just did an extraordinary job. If you can look on YouTube, if you search Flight 90 rescue, there are tons of video on YouTube. It's the most extraordinary flying that I've ever seen. Very, very low over the water, and there's debris all over the place. The whole idea of it was crazy. Any little piece of debris could have blown up, hit a rotor, and brought everything down on all of them. And it got to a point where they're retrieving the last victim when the paramedic, the rescue technician, Gene Windsor, the last woman who was in the water, she'd been in there for half an hour. He threw down the rope to her, and he said, "Take it." And her hands were frozen. She could not grip. And she said, I can't. So he unfastened himself from the helicopter, and you see him at the door holding onto this woman. The only thing that is, he basically has wedged his butt against the bottom of the door and his feet on the skid, and he's standing there. And the only thing that's holding him in the helicopter is attached is the cord to his communications, and that's it. At leaning over this icy water, reaching and grabbing this woman, and just barely has her on the toe of his boot, just barely. And it's just oh my God, this is just, I'd never seen anything. Fortunately, they made it to shore. They were all fine. They were all saved. He did not fall out, but what a risk that he took. He was in full flight gear. If he'd gone in the water, he would have sunk like a stone. But they did what had to be done, and they saved him. And the image of that rescue with uh, uh, the flight attendant hanging from his boot is just iconic. And anybody who I think works in the field, any first responder, I think that it's one of these historical cases to look at this video. And it is absolutely spellbinding, absolutely breathtaking what they did.
I mean, that just defies belief. And like you said, it just goes over and above. And to your point, Bruce, you forget, how both advanced we are now, but also how even sort of 30/40 years ago, there really wasn't the mechanisms in place and indeed the technology in place. And there wasn't the differentiation, as you were saying, the helicopters weren't differentiated for rescue and or search and rescue and or sort of emergency medical services. So, and you forget that. So it's really profound to hear that story. Bruce, you used to be an EMT yourself, and one of the aspects really, and we deep dive on the podcast about and really unpick fundamental attributes of PTSD and debriefing and how important that is. Can I get you to speak to really what struck you about interviewing rescuers and indeed witnesses experiencing trauma and loss in the aftermath of this event, and indeed look, this is long before we had the understanding of PTSD that we do now, the debriefing culture that we do now. But could I get you to speak to really what struck you from interviewing people about the profound trauma that they experienced of that day?
One thing that struck me when I spoke with people was that these recollections were as fresh as they happened yesterday. And there was one woman uh, by the name of Ruby Mae Thomas. I made a really great effort to track down and find somebody who was actually in the derailed subway car, and I did. It was quite an effort. And she was in her 70s now. She's a delightful woman, I think 72, 73 years old. And I finally tracked her down, got her on the phone, and I asked her, are you the Ruby Thomas who was on the subway car in 1982? He says, well, yes. And, she just launches right into telling me all about that day. And here's what I was, just like, oh my gosh, it was just had to sort of press a button. And these people had stories. And they recalled not just the people who were there, I might add, but all those folks, they recalled that day very vividly, what they ate, what they were doing. But that's also true. People, when this comes up on Reddit or different places, and people talk about that day, when I spoke with people and I mention that day, they'll invariably interrupt me and they tell me what they were doing that day, and it's that it affected people much in the way that the Challenger explosion did, 9/11, the where people recall, exactly, where they were and what they were doing at that moment when they learned of this. And it had that sort of impact and immediacy. But the people who had experienced, they all had their different, the survivors of the Flight 90, and there were five who ultimately survived. They all had their own after story, some better than others. Some never. I don't think any of them really fully recovered from the experience and had, quote unquote, normal life ever again. They all bore scars of that experience to this day, and it's never far from in their consciousness. Really, I mean, it's a really a life altering experience. But the people who everybody who was involved in that day came away with it with a life changing experience.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Bruce, you spoke to the fact that there were no relay um, um, mechanisms for the underground, which is something we faced actually in 7/7 in 2005. Just there's an absence, a complete cut-off of communication in the underground tunnels in the London Underground in 2005. From your research and that you denote in the book, really some of these systemic and procedural lessons that emerged from this disaster that, in a way, has fundamentally influenced later emergency planning and interagency cooperation, which probably exists now because of that day.
A lot of it. I've another major incident that I've had the opportunity to talk with people about is the 9/11 at the Pentagon in Virginia. There were many. I assumed that the response at 9/11 went all in all, fairly. The response part went fairly smoothly. People, did what they're supposed to do. I've since heard stories of some of the chaos and confusion that were there, but there were a lot of lessons learned on January 13th that absolutely went into lessening, mitigating some of the impact of 9/11 by working out some of these problems earlier on. But in terms of this day, both the metro crash and the Air Florida 90, it's probably one of the most pivotal mass fatality incidents in the U.S. I mean, it changed things from aviation to airport maintenance activities. But in terms of what it did for the region, they, to their credit, these governments in D.C. and the counties in the outlying Maryland and Virginia, they got their act together. There was a group called the Washington area, the Council of Governments, and they got everybody together, sat them down, and they worked out, a real mutual aid agreements, and they actually within months did a multi-jurisdiction exercise. They corrected the deficiencies in the radio. Washington incorporated. That's when they went from police had their own dispatch center and fire, and so they merged and they have one 911 center that integrates all of them and dispatches to the different agencies. They've fixed the problems in the subway system they've installed repeaters. Many of the deficiencies that were brought to light on January 13th have been remedied since then. In terms of aviation, I mean, they changed it from how they de-ice airplanes. There's some standards to it. They redesigned the flotation vests that are on airplanes. There's a long dozens and dozens of changes that can be attributed to this day.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And as you were saying, it's about integration of those lessons into contemporary practice, which makes absolutely the difference. So, it was a multifactorial picture, and the book does well, Bruce, in you really unpack the multifactorial nature of the weather, the decision making, but also the profound human factors at play that day. And could I really get you to speak to really how these themes echo into modern disaster and aviation safety training?
It's safe to say that, because of January 13th, 1982, every person certainly who travels on commercial aviation benefits because of that day. The changes that were made at the time, they wouldn't even tell people how to put on the flotation vest unless you're 160 miles out over open water. They wouldn't do that. And now it's standard. Every time you go on an airplane, at least in the United States, they show you how to put on the vest and how it inflates and all that. In terms of the thing about emergency services, not just medical, but it's one of these things that runs in the background that most people, if they're fortunate, never experienced in their life. They expect it to work. You pick up the phone and help comes, and it's supposed to work that way. A lot of the changes and improvements are invisible because it works, so they, from the centralized dispatch to better resource management to the system command and these sorts of things. That it's that the incident command is used on incidents of all kinds. It's more of a routine thing now. So we benefit from the experiences from the decades since then, and it's important not just when you have it's one thing to have a plan. It looks really, really good. It's written on paper. It's all bound and everything, but you need to revisit it, and you need to. Technology changes, people change, things change, and so you need to revisit it. Think of things that you haven't thought of before. It needs to be updated, and it's not enough to have a plan, but you really need to practice it, and that's really where the rubber meets the road, is to act it out in real life. So it's because of those experiences that countless people have benefited, not just in the Washington area, but as a profession in the field. I think has improved dramatically since then. I've been in it a long time. I know that things are very, very different today than when I started in the 1970s.
So, the media's role, Bruce, and you denote this in the book, this incident was broadcast live to millions of people across the US and globally. But, how did real-time media coverage shape public perception of emergency responders? And indeed, just if I could get your thoughts on how you think that might differ today.
Well, we didn't have social media then. That would be really interesting to think about how things may have been communicated differently if they had smartphones and social media. The thing, what really about this in terms of media, is that this was one of the first major incidents to be broadcast almost in real time. It was still one of the networks had it national. They broke it into the national news while the rescue was still going on. But CNN, the era of 24-hour news, began in 1980. This happened in 1982. So it was really the idea of a 24-hour news cycle was still very fairly new at the time. And here this thing happens that people are watching practically in real time, and it had an immediacy and impact to it that um, I had never experienced before. You're watching a life and death struggle almost live on television. I mean, that is, I hate to say it, great television. I mean, it was just dramatic. It was just visually, it's holy Toledo. This is amazing. Um, Now, and the mentioning these plans, there were plans to designate hospitals as a primary trauma center where they would be notified of a mass fatality incident, and they would communicate to the other hospitals. They had these plans to alert hospitals ahead of time to find out their capabilities, and so you could send people to the appropriate places. And none of that worked. Absolutely none of it worked. And what they ended up doing was the trauma centers were listening to the radio, which had reporters on the scene reporting what's going on. So the media in this instance really played a critical role. And that's why I really felt it was important to include this, because they are communicating this information to the public. The hospitals, they're hearing this over the radio and they go, oops, there's a plane crash. I better get back to the hospital. And the official channels of communication never worked. They were never activated, and they were never used. So in this particular case, the locally, both to communicate to the rescuers, it was important to communicate to family members and the public, to get the message out to where people were going to gather. And at the time, I mean, that's what they had, was radio and television. Today, no doubt, there would have been a Twitter feed and all pictures and all kinds of stuff. But it was the media played a really, really big role on that day.
So just as we come into land, Bruce, a couple more questions. One would be really around, given the current concerns in, stretched emergency services provision and also complex multi-hazard events, what does the worst day, your book, tell us really about resilience and readiness in modern urban systems?
modern emergency services, I think, are being asked to do more and more. Um, there's a lot of, it's really, really difficult for any public agency, to get more money, more funding. Everybody's being told to do more with less. Meanwhile, we're facing ever more sophisticated things in the field. Now we have to deal with electric vehicles and all new sorts of approaches and training that how to extricate somebody from these newer situations. And people, to their credit, they do the best that they can with what they have. I have not heard um, it, I'm not intimately involved in the field so much these days, but this what fire service and EMS always had going for it, I think, is the sense of community and this brotherhood that gives people a sense of mission that you don't see in a lot of other public service jobs. It's a special job that attracts special people. And I think that has a lot going with it. But things are going to get to a point. Money matters, quality of life matters, and so I just hope that this just shines a light on the important work that first responders do every day, and gives for the public appreciation of what the job is like, the sorts of things that they face, how they think, and how they react. And if it does some of that, then that's good too.
You've described this book as one that had to be written. What personal connection and or realization, Bruce, stayed with you after hearing these stories for 4 decades on?
When I saw it, when I saw that rescue, the rescue video, and you see just this little bit that's on the TV screen, but you and I know there's a lot more that's going on in the background that people don't appreciate in the dispatch centers, and they're communicating back and forth and rallying resources, and that's what was interested me, was that that is absolutely fascinating, but all this other stuff that was going on, that had to have been going on. And then there's bits and pieces I learned about that day. That rescue is amazing, but at that same time, they had a subway derailment that they had to deal with that too, while they're responding to vehicles on the bridge and getting people to the hospital. This is all going on at the same time. Oh, and the city was shut down in a massive snowstorm, and we couldn't communicate on radios. And every time I heard, this is absolutely mind blowing, and it just, in my mind, it made me think of sort of a throwback to a 1970s mega disaster movie. And I admit, in writing the book, I watched them all. I watched Towering Inferno and the airport movies and Avalanche and all these. But it was that sort of sensibility of a mega disaster. And this was true. And it was just, I thought it was the most amazing things I'd ever seen. That day was just we hear about unsung heroes. Those heroes shouldn't be unsung anymore. I wanted to sing those heroes. There was a lot of people who were involved. The guy who flew the helicopter, he got his reward and all these things, but there were dozens of people, and I wanted to name as many as I could. There were people who were at the riverside, ordinary folks who didn't get their name in the paper, and I wanted to point them out that they were all involved too. All these folks, from the first person who got on the CB radio on the bridge to call the volunteer who's sitting in her apartment, who listens to the radio. She calls up the dispatch center, and this whole chain. There was a literal chain at the riverside, but there was a metaphorical chain in the community. These people all coming together on this one day for this one purpose. And that really struck me. And I thought that that was a story that needed to be told. It had nobody, I waited. I thought, if that book, I would love to read that book. And nobody ever wrote it. So, okay, I'll do it. What am I going to do?
Listen, that's and to your point, Bruce, it's a story of humanity, and humanity coming together, and in the face of absolute tragedy, in various ways. So, listen, it's a fantastic read. We will put it in the show notes for people to link into. I do encourage people to go away and read it, especially from an EMT or pre-hospital perspective. It's a fantastic read, and listen. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for really getting into those first person narratives, because I think it's an absolutely powerful story. And it's just great to hear you unpick it now. So thank you so much, Bruce.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad you enjoyed it. You're very, very kind. And thank you very much. This has been great.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.